Archaeodeath, Death and Memory, Past and Present, with Professor Howard Williams.
Hey Archaeodeathlings, would you like to learn about my 2006 monograph, Death and Memory in Early Medieval Britain? Then listen on and view on. This is the book in itself. So this is the original hardback copy with Cambridge University Press. And it's now in paperback, so it's a lot cheaper. Actually, I lost my original copies, or they were nicked, or I gave them away, a mixture of all those things. So I actually bought this in a Chester second-hand bookshop recently for £3.50. Yay. If I've got to second-hand bookshops, you know you've made it as an author. So my only monograph to date is a book that I dedicated to three of my grandparents, my three at that time deceased grandparents, another one has since passed away. And it contains 7 chapters that set up a new thesis for looking at mortuary archaeology in the early Middle Ages. And I tried to do things that I think at the time were quite distinctive. I decided to take a island-wide perspective, which has its biases and problems. I don't really deal with the continental evidence, I don't really deal with Ireland, but I look at Britain without focusing only on early Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Saxon England. Now, inevitably, my background is in Anglo-Saxon archaeology, so there is an Anglo-Saxon, a southern eastern British bias in the book, but I try to, in various chapters, thematically, going through, deal with evidence from northern Britain, from what is now Scotland, from Wales, southwest, try to incorporate western and northern British material into the study. And the principle is to look at funerary ritual through the lens of social memory, and to then explore that not in a single story, a single linear narrative from the 5th century through to the 11th centuries, and not to just look at the southern eastern English-speaking, old English-speaking areas, to look at the various ways in which material culture, grave structures, funerary monuments, to look at the spatial dimensions of mortuary practice and how they're deployed to enhance commemoration. Now, my approach is to look at social memory as about remembering and forgetting, and not therefore about adhering or inscribing, but about a process of social reproduction. So it's a social approach. It's a practice-orientated approach to burial ritual, and it's also a sort of a contextual approach that tries to look at the evidence within a broader context of landscape and society. And in that regard, I think it still has merit 14 and a half or 15 years on as a study, and I think it's the only study that's trying to do a early medieval Britain wide review of funerary practice. Martin Carver's recent book Formative Britain does that in part within the rubric of personhood, and that's worth reading too. But I think a focus on memory makes us give attention to how the practices in early medieval societies were about connecting the living and the dead, and conceptions of the past which may be multi-layered and complex and fluid. And they may involve mythology, legend, they may involve sort of concepts of ethnicity and group history, family or community history, as well as personal biography. And how social memory is about remembering and forgetting, but also it's not simply about recalling the past in funerals, but about projecting futures, of recreating. It's a creative, performative act. And this is grounded in theory and approaches to death in other subjects, anthropology, history and sociology, and also in archaeological approaches to funerary ritual that connect up prehistoric archaeology in America and the UK and elsewhere in Northern Europe to early historic approaches too. So in all those regards, that was my aim for the book, and it got some good reviews, and I think I'm still proud of it in many ways. There's things I would have done differently. I got the dating of one brooch in one grave got wrong, according to Professor John Hines, but you know, you can rarely please everyone, is all I can say. There's things that maybe I didn't refine and things I could have added. And I talk a lot, there is a bias, as I said, towards early Anglo-Saxon, 5th, 6th and early 7th century, southern eastern England, southern eastern Britain more broadly. But I do contend with other types of evidence. Now I start off by giving that theoretical framework of the backdrop to the study of early medieval burial data, which goes back to the 18th century and 19th century, and particularly what we could say the origins of archaeology, and in part within a colonial and imperial framework of understanding Britain and its origins, through to the development of more modern approaches to burial and funerary practice more broadly. And I draw into that theoretical focus the various different strands of archaeological evidence we have from the early medieval period. And I try to talk about convergences and divergences in how we look at this evidence. And I have this really rubbish, I think. I mean, a lot of people seem to like it, but I thought it was just very. These diagrams can be really cheesy, in my opinion. And I see a lot of people doing them. But anyway, with the benefit of hindsight, I think maybe it's not as bad as I thought it was. But I was cringed having to do something conceptual like a diagram like that. Anyway. But I'm trying to articulate how memory is multi-layered, has various prospective and retrospective dimensions to it, particularly when we're dealing with the funerary ritual itself, not simply the monument you raise afterwards, but the funerary ritual itself as a process of remembering and forgetting. And I take that forward chapter 1, and then I have a thematic approach to my evidence as I move forward. I start off by looking at objects and theorising objects in terms of biography and memory and materiality, the selection, the symbolism, and the context in which they're used. And then I use case studies for my approach, going through some furnished burials of the 6th century from Berensfield, and then going through into 7th century burials and later burials. So I look at case study by St Edmund, Harford Farm, looking at the burials from there, and also the ways in which sort of the final phase burial ritual actually enhanced and elaborated the biographies of objects and their commemorative roles rather than reduce them just because there's fewer objects in graves. Those that are selected, how we're very careful in their selection process. Then I turn the attention to the body and its transformation as a mnemonic practice in itself. The choice to cremate the dead, to inhume the dead, and the relationships between them in the pre-Christian context. But then I look through at Christian bodies and transforming cadavers in Christian context, with the careful placing and arrangement in field cemeteries and churchyard cemeteries. And that chapter I'm quite proud of, because it also opens up the idea about the mnemonic of re-investigating graves, and a field of research that has been taken forward by a number of scholars since, in both the pre-Christian and the Christian period, sort of entanglement of people and bodies and multiple stages of that engagement through the funerary ritual. So having dealt with objects and bodies, the stuff we find in graves, I then look at graves as a mnemonic composition themselves. I'm drawing together objects, structures, artefacts, different layers, and I try to take forward and critique the idea of a grave as a text that can be read as a single composition, which has been driven a lot of the work, very influential work of Guy Housel and Martin Carver, that has since span on and fed into Viking Age scholars such as Neil Price's work on funerary ritual and others. Bonnie Efros's work has been very influential on me as well, I should say, and Helen Geek as well. Part of the thing is I both have a strong support for, but also critique of, is Helen Geek's sort of approach, and also Victoria Thompson. And I look at sort of some of the more complex, high status, late 6th, early 7th century burials from Snape, and looking at them as compositions that involve both display but also tempos of display and concealment, so that the funeral becomes a process of showing and revealing and concealing in an interleaving stages. And I try to point out evidence for how this would have worked, and a lot of our artist reconstructions and our narratives try to make furnished burial, and indeed burial of any kind of this period, is about a display. And I think that very much is an uncritical reflection of our sort of American style embalming processes, where you put the body lie it in state before burial. And I think that's part of what's going on, but I think it maybe misses a lot if we only see that as the driving force of early medieval furnished burial. And I look at kist burials in this context. This allows me to bring the Western and Northern British evidence in, where we don't have grave goods, and the body position is much more normative or much formalised, as supine extended. But we do have different types of burial structure, coffin and kists or stone lines, stone boxes used for the burial of the dead. So I talk about those, which is Hallow Hill from Fife. And then we move to the external grave markers. I look at funerary monumentality, and I critique the focus on big mounds and try to put that in context by looking at monument reuse, a theme I'd addressed in my master's research, and then taking that forward, looking at other kinds of burial structure in Western Britain, these little special graves of Capel-Eithon, those kind of things. And I then look at Sutton Hoo. So I do look at some of the big mounds and look at the genealogy of monuments built and constructed at that site, and Pictish square barrows as well. It's one of the few, I think my book is one of the few studies that isn't by a scholar focusing specifically on early medieval Scotland, that tries to draw that evidence in to a broader debate. And my last major chapter before conclusion looks at landscape. So I've gone from the inside the grave, and I sort of thematically explore how we theorise and approach burial location, looking at cemetery situation within earlier Iron Age enclosures here at Bromfield in Shropshire, through to looking at the relationship of cemeteries and settlements, as here at West Heselton, a schematised plan of the burial sites and the areas of settlement. And I look at mortuary geographies within the monastic sacred context, looking at Ripon, for example. And I look at how we theorise mortuary landscapes over the long terms, thinking about how we look at texts as archaeologists, and think about even fictional or fantastical or legendary, but legendary monuments within text. So I look at Beowulf's Mound as an example of how we might do that, and the material dimensions to it. There's Taplow, early 7th century princely grave in Buckinghamshire, and Astle also. So I look at also accumulations of the cumulative effect of burying the dead in the same place over long periods of time, through Cannington. And then you go back to my opening example, which was, I didn't mention, Swallowcliff Down, the 7th century bed burial in Wiltshire, to sort of draw out some of the key implications of moving beyond ethnic, chronological or spatial dichotomies to try and look at themes that connect together deathways in the early Middle Ages from the 5th through to the 10th, 11th centuries, that sort of perhaps counter some of the standard historical narratives and looks in a thematic way at the evidence. Now, that's only a quick summary, but go and buy your copy now. Someone recently told me that they actually used their copy when they were undergraduates. I felt very touched by that. Very, very well established archaeologists now said they actually like my book. And it's the only monograph I've produced, and there's a number of reasons for that. Personal choice, life has got in the way, but also I don't think monographs are my principal medium of communication. I've produced over 100 book chapters and journal articles, but also now heading into double figures of edited collections, working with other scholars. I've done a lot of collaborative work, and that takes a lot more time. I could have produced a lot more monographs rather than wasting so much energies on trying to collaborate with people, some of who get something out of it and there's a good synergy, other people who do somewhat sponge off my efforts, which has been a bit frustrating over the years. But the mixed results from that editing is my point. Collaboration is always a pain in the arse, don't let anyone tell you otherwise, but it actually can be really fun and take you places you'd never go on your own. That's the whole point. But having said that, it has meant that I have not done any more monographs. But also, it's part of being collegiate. It's a teaching-orientated university where monographs are difficult to compose. Some of my colleagues are not in a position to do a monograph, and so I felt there was a bit of collegiality to making sure that I also didn't pack in the monographs, but used deployed my endeavours, my work and my research in a more distributed way, collaborating with others. And now obviously I'm doing a series of books with students, which is another key point of what I do. So partly that was by design and personal circumstance and a collegiate spirit and a desire to collaborate and take the work forward. But I did promise in this 2006 book a second monograph, and I have contracted up to do a long monograph for many years. Whether they renege on that contract because I haven't delivered or not, I don't really mind anymore. I can find a publisher for my work wherever I please. But my point is, I do endeavour to produce a second monograph at some point on early medieval monumentality and memory, but that hasn't transpired as yet. Just time and so many other projects going on. So I hope that video gives you a little bit of an insight into my 2006 book, which is now available in paperback. Get your copy if you must. Please do actually get it as an ebook as well if you're that way inclined. But do have a look and dip into it, because I do feel there's many things I've expanded on from it, and it also drew on my earlier work and pulled things together in a way that I'm reasonably pleased with. It's not without fault, but I looking back, I think, yeah, it's all right. 7 out of 10, and perhaps not as cited as it should be. But then I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm the author. But do drop into my other videos, subscribe to this channel, and drop me a comment if there's any questions you have about the book. Thank you very much.
If you've enjoyed this Archaeodeath video, why not check out the Archaeodeath blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.